Good evening, and welcome to what we could practically call the next 2 hours of applied Buddhist wisdom, which is a very optimistic way of saying that you're going to pretend you're trying to sleep, but you're actually going to stay awake until the end, finding out how ancient monks also had anxiety problems. Today we are going to explore why entire civilizations have spent millennia trying to find shortcuts to inner peace. Conceptually brilliant, practically questionable, and ironically perfect for anyone who should be sleeping right now. And look, I know what you're thinking. Do we really need 2 hours to understand that enlightenment doesn't have a delivery date? The answer is yes, absolutely yes, because it turns out that between saving a Zen quote on Facebook and really understanding why people dedicated their entire lives to reaching these conclusions, there is an absurdly large difference. And you have insomnia anyway. Tonight, we will meet 5 Buddhists who decided that millennial patience was, well, too time-consuming and created their own methods of spiritual optimization. We will meet Arthur, a Burmese monk who made a 30-day schedule for nirvana, like those people who schedule the gym for January and expect to be in shape by February. We will visit Isabella, a Chinese princess who decided that when you have literally everything, you obviously need literally nothing, trading imperial palaces for mountain caves, because apparently spiritual seeking always involves conditions that defy common sense. We will travel to William, a Japanese samurai who spent 4 years trying to cut cherry blossom petals with mathematical precision in an impressive demonstration of how to turn an obsession with perfection into a slightly questionable exact science. And we will end with James, a Korean hermit who interpreted simple life as building the most elaborate monastic complex in the region for one person, proving that spiritual ego can be even more creative than material ego. If this sounds like the perfect excuse not to sleep for another 2 hours like this episode, subscribe to the channel, because we still have stories about Greek mystics, medieval alchemists, and shamans who thought that talking to plants was a valid scientific method. We begin in a jungle in Myanmar, where someone has just invented the first spiritual agenda in history and is about to discover that Buddha never mentioned. Deadlines for a very specific reason. Myanmar, 1547, and we are in the dry season, which is an important detail when you are about to meet someone who has turned spiritual enlightenment into a project with a delivery date. Arthur Aindawiya woke up that December morning with the unshakable confidence of someone who has just solved a problem that has plagued Buddhists for over 2,000 years. The problem? Buddha had taken 6 years to reach awakening. 6 whole years, which was obviously questionable time management. Our protagonist was a 34-year-old monk who lived in the Kyaukpadang monastery near Bagan, a region that at the time was teeming with golden pagodas and an impressive number of very serious monks discussing sutras, which are basically the sacred Buddhist texts, like a spiritual library that someone decided to make mandatory. Arthur was different, not because he was less serious, but because he had applied practical logic to the Dharma, which is the set of Buddha's teachings. Let's say it's the instruction manual for life, only written by someone who didn't believe in summaries. He had spent the last 15 years studying sacred texts, meditating in traditional positions, following all the precepts, and after a decade and a half of progress, well, let's say he was still waiting for that moment of cosmic clarity that the masters promised, which was slightly frustrating, considering that some people reported transcendental experiences after a few months. The math was simple. If Buddha needed 6 years, and considering that Buddha was basically a beginner when he started, Arthur, with 15 years of experience, should be able to achieve the same result in much less time. It was a matter of efficiency. The plan came up during a conversation with Master Olin, the oldest master in the monastery, a 67-year-old man who had that infinite patience typical of someone who had given up on hurry decades ago. Arthur had asked respectfully how much longer it would be necessary for something significant to happen spiritually. Master Olin had replied with a smile that could mean both soon and maybe in the next life, which was not exactly the clarity Arthur was looking for, especially considering that he had observed other monks, some with less study than him, reporting experiences that seemed substantial. It was then that Arthur had his organizational epiphany. If Enlightenment was a matter of total dedication, absolute concentration, and complete removal of distractions. Then the problem was not method, it was intensity. People were doing it right, just too slowly. He calculated, if someone could dedicate 100% of their time, 100% of their energy, in perfectly controlled conditions, without interruptions, without worldly responsibilities, without even the distraction of eating regularly, 30 days would be more than enough. The Kyokpadang monastery was perfect for this. It had a natural cave in the back, isolated, silent, with a spring of clean water. It was as if the place had been designed for intensive retreats. Arthur had tested the place a few times, spending a few days there, and the concentration was remarkably better. His plan was elegantly simple: 30 days of almost total fasting, only water and maybe some fruit when absolutely necessary, continuous meditation, alternating between samatha, which is concentration meditation, like training the mind to focus on one thing, and vipassana, which is insight meditation, basically looking closely at how your mind works until you understand that nothing is as it seems. 16 hours a day of formal practice, 6 hours of rest, 2 hours for basic needs. It was like a traditional retreat, but optimized, concentrated, with no waste of time on activities that did not contribute directly to the goal. Arthur had even prepared a detailed schedule. The first week focused on concentration, the second on understanding, the third on equanimity, the fourth for consolidating the experience. It was methodologically sound, based on proven techniques in an ideal environment with an experienced practitioner. What could go wrong? Master Olin listened to the plan with that same serene expression he used for everything, from discussions about sacred texts to reports of snakes in the refectory. When Arthur finished explaining his strategy, the master simply said that if that was what his heart indicated, he had the monastery's blessing, which Arthur interpreted as enthusiastic approval when it was probably closer to, let's see how this goes. December arrived in Kyokpadang with that dry heat that makes any sensible person look for shade, but Arthur was too busy finalizing the details of his spiritual revolution to worry about thermal comfort. He had spent the last 2 weeks in preparations that, well, let's say were more detailed than the invasion plans of some armies. The first step had been to map the cave exactly, which was about a 15-minute walk from the main monastery, hidden behind a rock formation that seemed to have been sculpted specifically for intensive spiritual retreats. The cave was approximately 3 meters wide by 4 deep, high enough to stand up, and had an opening that allowed ventilation without direct exposure to the sun. Arthur had tested the acoustics, excellent for mantras, the temperature stable throughout the day, and the privacy absolute. The water spring was only a few meters away. It was as if the universe had conspired to create the perfect environment for his experiment, which he interpreted as a divine sign when it was probably just convenient geography. The schedule was printed on palm leaves because Arthur believed in proper documentation, even for revolutionizing millennial traditions. 4 weeks divided into strategic phases, like an intensive enlightenment course, only without a teacher, without a certificate, and with a real risk of, well, several things that he preferred not to consider in detail. The first week would be dedicated to absolute concentration, intensive samatha, focusing the mind on a single thing until any distraction was physically impossible. Arthur had chosen the breath as the object of concentration, which was traditional, safe, and always available, theoretically. The second week would be deep vipassana, microscopic observation of every sensation, every thought, every moment of consciousness, until penetrating the fundamental nature of reality. It was like reverse engineering one's own mind, only without an instruction manual. The third week would be integration, combining concentration with perception to achieve states that the text described with words like bliss, liberation, and other expressions that sounded promising, but were annoyingly vague about practical details. The fourth week would be consolidation, basically ensuring that any awakening achieved was not just a temporary hallucination induced by prolonged fasting. Arthur was being methodically cautious about this. because he had read enough reports of people who confused extreme hunger with mystical experiences. The fast would be almost total, water always, some fruit when absolutely necessary, maybe a little rice if the situation became technically unsustainable. Arthur had calculated that a healthy adult could function in these conditions for a month, especially if most of the energy was directed towards mental rather than physical activities. He had even consulted Bhante Sirimangala, the oldest monk in the monastery, a 72-year-old man who had spent 5 decades studying texts on spiritual nutrition. Sirimangala had listened to the plan with that expression that doctors use when patients explain clearly impossible symptoms, but replied that there was nothing in the sutras that prohibited prolonged fasts for meditative purposes, which Arthur interpreted as qualified medical approval. The daily schedule was ambitious. Wake up at 4 a.m., an hour of walking meditation around the cave, 15 hours of sitting meditation with 5-minute breaks every 2 hours, 1 hour for basic needs, 6 hours of sleep. It was like a full-time job, only the salary was spiritual enlightenment, and the EI's benefits included, well, theoretically, liberation from universal suffering. Arthur had tested reduced versions of the schedule, 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours of continuous meditation, and the results were encouraging. Concentration improved dramatically. Insights arose frequently. Mental states he had never experienced became accessible. Clearly, it was a matter of scaling the process. The last detail had been to convince Master Olin, the leader of the monastery, to allow a full month of isolation. Olin had asked some practical questions like, who would check if you are still alive, and what is the plan if something goes wrong, but eventually agreed that if Arthur was determined to do it, it was better to do it with minimal supervision than, well, to run away to do it alone somewhere dangerous. Arthur had interpreted this as total confidence in his judgment. The night before the retreat began, Arthur meditated in his room with a sense of anticipation that was part spiritual excitement, part pre-exam nervousness. Tomorrow would begin the experiment that, if it worked, would revolutionize his life. If it went wrong, well, at least it would be an interesting educational experience. He fell asleep at 9 p.m., scheduled to wake up at 4 a.m., ready to start the first express enlightenment schedule in history. What could go wrong with such a well-documented plan? The first day of Arthur's retreat began at 4 a.m. with the enthusiasm of someone who has just discovered the solution to all of humanity's problems, which lasted approximately until 6 a.m., when the reality of the situation began to present itself in, let's say, unexpected ways. The cave that had seemed perfect during the tests suddenly revealed features that Arthur had not considered adequately. First, the echo. Every breath, every movement, every murmured thought returned amplified, as if the mountain itself were commenting on his meditative methods, which was a distraction. Second day, Arthur discovered that fasting was not just eating less. It was discovering that your stomach has its own personality and very clear opinions about your spiritual plans. Around noon, the hunger pangs began to sound like organized protests, which was not exactly on the schedule. Third day, the hallucinations began, or as Arthur preferred to call them, preliminary mystical experiences. Shadows moved on the cave walls, voices whispered contradictory advice, and in one particularly confusing moment, he had a 20-minute conversation with what he later realized was a rock formation. Exactly how you conspired against your own sleep schedule to find out if this plan would work. The meticulously planned schedule began to adapt to the circumstances. 16 hours of meditation became as many hours as possible before passing out. 6 hours of sleep became irregular naps between episodes of dizziness, and the 2 hours for basic needs expanded to include time to question life choices. Fourth day, Arthur realized that he had drastically underestimated the psychological impact of complete isolation. Imaginary conversations with Master Olin became elaborate debates on Buddhist methodology. He even won 3 arguments and lost 2, which was statistically encouraging but clinically worrying. The water from the spring, which he had tested and approved, now tasted like, well, as if it knew it was being consumed by someone who deliberately refused food. It was as if even the water was judging his decisions, which was not in the texts about spiritual retreats. 5th day, the visions intensified. Arthur saw Buddha, who patiently explained to him that enlightenment did not work like express delivery. He saw his childhood parents, who asked why he had not become a carpenter as planned, and he saw a tiger, which offered practical advice on hunting, which was confusing considering that tigers were not native to the region, which worked perfectly, as long as you redefine perfectly as still technically conscious. 6th day, Arthur began to suspect that maybe, just maybe, his spiritual math had some flaws. The human body apparently does not operate like a device that can be optimized indefinitely through willpower and well-organized schedules. Who could have predicted that? The meditations became survival exercises. Concentration turned into trying not to faint while breathing, and spiritual understanding evolved into realizing that he was very hungry and possibly delirious. It was progress, in a very specific way. 7th day, Arthur had to admit that some of the transcendental experiences might be related to severe hypoglycemia. The line between spiritual awakening and metabolic malfunction was practically a little blurred, which did not necessarily invalidate the experiment, it just complicated it slightly. And before anyone thinks, this will help me, relax, it won't, because the story only gets more interesting from here. The cave began to seem smaller, or Arthur was getting bigger, or reality was adjusting in creative ways. The walls sometimes pulsed, the ceiling occasionally breathed, and the floor developed the disconcerting tendency to move when he was not looking directly at it. Around the 8th day, Arthur made an important discovery. Prolonged fasting not only purifies the body, it also frees the mind from annoying conventions like linear logic, consistent spatial perception, and the ability to distinguish between internal thoughts and external conversations. It was exactly the kind of revelation he had planned, just a little more intense than anticipated. 9th day, and Arthur was officially in the unexplored territory between deep spiritual experience and mild medical emergency. It was at this moment, somewhere between hallucinogenic hunger and creative dehydration, that he had his first real understanding of the nature of impermanence. It was not through elaborate philosophical contemplation, it was through the visceral perception that, well, everything was constantly changing, including his ability to distinguish between rocks and people, between thoughts and conversations, and between, I am meditating deeply, and I urgently need carbohydrates. Impermanence, one of the central concepts of Buddhism, which teaches that nothing remains the same, that everything is in constant flux, that resisting change causes suffering, suddenly made sense in a way that 15 years of theoretical study had not been able to convey. Because Arthur was experiencing change in real time, in his body, in his mind, in his perception of reality, which was technically an educational victory, achieved through methods that probably violated several basic health guidelines. 10th day, Arthur discovered something fascinating about anxiety for results. When you are too weak to worry about schedules, the pressure for progress simply disappears. It was as if the urgency for enlightenment had been replaced by the urgency to continue functioning as a living organism. This revealed an interesting contradiction in his original approach. He had tried to accelerate awakening through extreme intensity, but awakening, apparently, required the kind of relaxation that is impossible when you are constantly monitoring your spiritual progress. It was like trying to fall asleep while checking the clock every 5 minutes. 11th day, hunger transformed into something almost transcendental. It was no longer a distraction, it was a teacher, teaching about desire, about attachment, about the difference between real need and mental habit. Arthur was directly experiencing the teachings on tanha, thirst or desire, which the texts described as the root of suffering. Because apparently, in every spiritual tradition, the best way to understand abstract concepts is to experience them in a way that actively challenges your survival. 12th day, Arthur realized that he had spent 2 weeks trying to control his spiritual experience, planning, timing, optimizing, when what was really happening was surrender, not by choice but by necessity, because he simply no longer had the energy to resist what was happening. And in this involuntary surrender, something changed. Meditation stopped being something he did and became something that happened. The breath stopped being an object of concentration and became just breath. Consciousness stopped being something to monitor and became simply what was present. It was exactly as the masters described, only they had forgotten to mention that the path to get there could involve hunger-related hallucinations. 13th day, Arthur had a revelation about patience. Not the theoretical patience he had studied in the texts, but practical patience, the patience of someone who finally understood that forcing enlightenment is like trying to force sleep. The more you try, the more distant it becomes. The texts spoke of Khanti, patience or tolerance, as one of the fundamental virtues, but Arthur had interpreted this as be patient while applying efficient methods, when in fact it meant stop trying to be efficient with processes that are inherently non-linear. 14th day, 2 full weeks, and Arthur realized that he had learned more about Dharma in a state of near starvation than in years of formal study. Not because fasting was necessary, but because fasting had removed his ability to overthink the experience. He could no longer analyze what was happening, he could only be present with it, which is the classic ancestral approach to simple problems, solutions that almost kill you with hunger. And it was then, exactly halfway through his 30-day experiment, that Arthur understood the fundamental irony of his entire endeavor. He had created the most elaborate schedule in history to discover something that could only be discovered by stopping following schedules. It was like using a detailed map to find something that only exists when you stop looking. 15th day, and Arthur was officially in what the Buddhist texts do not describe as the territory between awakening and nutritional disaster. It was at this moment, when he could barely distinguish between deep meditation and simply not having the energy to move, that something unexpected happened. The urgency disappeared completely. Not because he had reached some sublime state, but because he literally had no strength to worry about schedules. It was as if his body had gone on a union strike against his spiritual ambition, and in that strike his mind finally relaxed. For the first time in 15 years of practice, Arthur was not trying, not measuring, not comparing his progress with ancient texts. He was simply present with whatever was happening, including the hunger, the thirst, and the growing suspicion that he might have slightly exaggerated the methods. And it was exactly at that moment, when he stopped seeking enlightenment, that something like wisdom appeared. Not with cosmic fireworks, not with visions of Buddha applauding, but with a quiet and almost embarrassing understanding that, well, maybe the hurry was exactly the problem. Because apparently, in every spiritual tradition, the thing you want most is exactly the thing you cannot force. It's like trying to catch your own reflection in the water. The more you stir, the more distorted it becomes. 16th day. Arthur made a decision that supposedly could be considered wisdom or surrender, depending on how you interpret eating some fruit before permanently passing out. He broke the fast, not out of weakness, but out of a practical understanding that corpses do not achieve enlightenment. The first mango in 2 weeks tasted like, well, as if all of creation had conspired to create this specific experience of sweetness. It was hard to say if this was heightened perception or just extreme hunger, but frankly, the difference seemed irrelevant. And before anyone thinks, this will teach me about patience, it won't, because the real lesson is more complicated than that. Arthur had discovered that optimization and awakening are fundamentally incompatible. You can't hack wisdom, you can only create the conditions for it to appear when it wants to. 17th day. With a little food in his system, Arthur began to evaluate what he had really learned, and the list was surprisingly practical. First, prolonged fasting does not accelerate enlightenment, it only accelerates hallucinations. Second, spiritual schedules are like trying to schedule when you will fall in love, theoretically possible, practically ridiculous. Third, and perhaps most important, the texts that spoke of patience were not being poetic, they were being literal. Spiritual practice is, well, a practice, not a project with a completion date. It was like learning to play the piano. You don't mark on the calendar the day you will become Mozart. 20th day. Arthur decided that 3 weeks were enough to prove that 3 weeks were not enough for anything. He had turned a spiritual retreat into an endurance experiment and discovered that endurance, while impressive, is not enlightenment. Which worked perfectly as long as you redefine perfectly as learned some important lessons without dying in the process. When he finally left the cave, Arthur looked like someone who had spent 3 weeks questioning life choices, which, apparently, was accurate. Master Olin received him with that same serene smile, which Arthur now interpreted correctly as, "I expected it to end like this." "So, how was the 30-day awakening?" asked the monastery leader, with the tone of someone who already knew the answer. "Educational," replied Arthur, "very educational." And that perhaps was the first truly wise answer he had given in months. Arthur's story spread through the monasteries of the region, not as an example of failure, but as a perfect demonstration of why Buddha had taken 6 years. Not because he was slow, but because some things simply cannot be rushed, no matter how well you organize the process. Arthur returned to his normal meditation routine with one fundamental difference. He stopped checking the clock, stopped measuring progress, stopped treating awakening as a productivity goal, and ironically, that's when his practice really began. Because humans, regardless of the era, always think that this time will be different, that this time they will find the shortcut that no one else has found, and sometimes, just sometimes, discovering that there is no shortcut is exactly the shortcut they were looking for. And while Arthur finally understood that enlightenment does not follow a corporate schedule, on the other side of the ocean, a Chinese princess was about to discover that when you have literally everything, the universe has a very specific way of suggesting that maybe you need literally nothing. Because apparently in all cultures, in all eras, there is always someone who looks at a perfectly comfortable life and thinks, "You know what's missing here? Hunger, cold, and a cave." Isabella had just turned 23 in the year 847 of the Tang dynasty, and was basically the most privileged person in the Chinese empire after the emperor himself, which, as you will discover, did not stop her from making one of the most radical decisions in the history of spiritual seeking. The imperial palace of Chang'an, where Isabella grew up, was basically what happens when you take all the imaginable luxuries in the world and decide that it's still not enough. Gardens so elaborate that they had full-time landscapers, just 2, ensure that every flower was at the perfect angle, libraries with texts hand-copied by scribes who dedicated entire years to a single work, and rooms decorated with silk that came from places so distant that the caravans took months just to arrive. Isabella woke up every day in rooms larger than entire houses, ate on gold plates, wore clothes that cost more than small cities, and had a team of servants whose only function was to make her life even easier than it already was. Someone to comb her hair, someone to choose her clothes, someone to test her food, someone to carry her books, and, this is historically documented, someone whose only responsibility was to hold a fan to ensure that she always had the ideal breeze. Her father, Li Wei, was a direct advisor to Emperor Xuanzong, which means that Isabella had access to literally anything that existed in the known world. Teachers who traveled entire continents just to give a class, jewels that were considered national, treasures, books that were unique in the world, and political influence that could move armies. Her daily routine consisted of waking up whenever she felt like it, choosing between 17 different types of tea, deciding which of the 4 private gardens she wanted to visit, selecting which of the hundreds of clothes she wanted to wear, and occasionally receiving visits from foreign diplomats who came to pay homage to the imperial family. It was, objectively speaking, the most perfect life any human being could have in the 9th century, which makes it even more intriguing that Isabella was absolutely, completely, deeply miserable. Not the kind of sadness you feel when something specific is wrong, but that devastating existential feeling that, even having everything, you have nothing that really matters. It was as if all that perfection was a very elaborate golden prison, where every comfort was an invisible bar. She began to notice things that were previously completely normal, like she never made a real decision, never solved a real problem, never faced a challenge that wasn't blue or green scroll. Her entire life was a very sophisticated version of existing passively while other people did everything. It was during one of these mornings of premium existential boredom that Isabella decided to do something that, for a Tang dynasty princess, was considered slightly revolutionary. Read a book alone, without supervision, without someone, turning the pages without servants explaining each paragraph. The book, which had recently arrived from a mountainous region called Wudang, was a collection of Taoist texts on spiritual dispossession. The first line she read was, "True wealth is in simplicity. True wisdom is in dispossession. True peace is far from all material distractions." Isabella stopped reading, looked around her room, decorated with carpets that took artisans years to make, curtains embroidered with gold, threads that cost fortunes, furniture carved by masters who dedicated decades to mastering the art, and had one of those realizations that are simultaneously enlightening and terrifying. She was living the exact opposite of everything the text said was necessary to find any kind of real meaning in existence. She continued reading, "The wise seek the mountain, where silence teaches what no master can teach, where necessity purifies what no luxury can purify, where solitude reveals what no company can reveal." And it was at that moment, surrounded by all the luxury of the Chinese Empire, that Isabella began to understand that maybe, just maybe, she was in the perfect situation to understand exactly what was wrong with her perfect situation. The text continued, "When we possess everything, we possess nothing. When we need nothing, we discover everything." Isabella closed the book and for the first time in 23 years had an idea that was completely, absolutely, unquestionably hers. Over the next few weeks, Isabella developed a new hobby that to any sensible person would seem completely harmless, but that, in the context of the Chinese imperial court, was slightly subversive. She began to ask questions. Not the kind of questions that princesses normally ask, like, which dress goes with these jewels? But questions like, is there anyone who really chose to live with nothing? And where exactly are these Wudang mountains? And, the most dangerous of all, what happens if someone technically decided to go there? She began by discreetly talking to the monks who visited the palace, who came to pay homage or bring religious texts for the imperial library, and she discovered that, apparently, there were people who voluntarily, purposefully, intentionally abandoned comfortable lives to live in conditions that challenged basically all notions of common sense. A Tibetan monk who had come to deliver Buddhist manuscripts told her about hermits who lived in caves in the mountains, eating once a day, sleeping on the floor, spending entire years without seeing another person, and, according to him, they were the wisest people he had ever met. Isabella, who had never been hungry for even an hour, who slept on beds with mattresses made of swan feathers, who was surrounded by people 24 hours a day, found this information strangely fascinating. Another visitor, a Taoist scholar from the Wudang Mountains, explained that the spiritual search through dispossession was a millennial tradition. People who deliberately moved away from everything they knew to discover who they really were when they had nothing left to define them. But does it work? Isabella asked, with the genuine curiosity of someone who had never had to question whether something worked, because everything had always worked perfectly for her. "It works," the scholar replied, "if you are willing to trade all the easy answers for all the hard questions." Isabella spent the whole night thinking about this sentence, because she began to realize that her entire life had been a sequence of easy answers. Are you hungry? There is food prepared. Are you tired? There are soft beds waiting. Do you want something? Someone will get it. Do you need something? It is already provided. She had never had a hard question, never faced a situation where there was not an immediate and comfortable solution, never discovered what she was really capable of, because she never needed to be capable of anything. It was then that Isabella began to do something that, in retrospect, should have been a warning sign to anyone around. She began to research methodically, systematically, obsessively everything about monastic life, material renunciation, and specifically the Wudang Mountains. She discovered that they were approximately a 3-week journey from the palace if you went by horse, which she knew how to do, having learned horse riding as part of her aristocratic education. She discovered that it had natural caves suitable for, supposedly, living, if you redefined suitable, as will not collapse immediately. She discovered that the region was known for having hermits who spent decades in solitary meditation, surviving on wild plants, spring water, and occasionally the generosity of local peasants who left offerings of food. And she discovered that, at least in theory, it was possible for a person to leave everything behind and simply disappear into the mountains, which brought Isabella to the most important and most terrifying question of her life. What if I did that? For weeks, she tested the idea, as if it were a mental experiment. Imagine waking up without servants. Imagine choosing your own clothes. Imagine preparing your own food. Imagine being silent for days on end. Imagine having nothing but your own thoughts. At first, the idea seemed absurd, almost comical. An imperial princess, raised in absolute luxury, living in a cave like a hermit. It was the kind of idea that any sensible person would immediately dismiss. But Isabella began to realize that she was far from being any sensible person. She was beginning to suspect that she was a person who preferred hard questions to easy answers, a person who wanted to discover who she really was when all the silk, all the gold, all the servants, and all the comfort were removed. And slowly, methodically, inevitably, what began as philosophical curiosity turned into a plan that technically was simple: wait for the right moment, gather only the essentials, leave a letter explaining her decision, and basically trade the most privileged life in the Chinese Empire for an existence that challenged all known concepts of rationality. Isabella knew it was madness, but she was beginning to suspect that maybe a little madness was exactly what her perfectly rational life needed. The night Isabella chose to execute her plan was one of those perfectly normal nights at the palace, where absolutely nothing indicated that in a few hours, the most privileged person in the Chinese Empire would be riding towards the mountains with the determination of someone who had clearly never thought about the practical implications of living in a cave. She waited until the guards were on their shift change, which always happened at midnight, because even when fleeing the safest life in the world, Isabella maintained her instinct for logistical efficiency. She took only the essentials, which from a princess's perspective meant 3 sets of silk clothes, some jewels, scrolls with Taoist texts, and in an impressive demonstration of practical planning, a bag of gold coins sufficient to buy a small city. Because when you have never had to think about money, it is difficult to calculate exactly how much you need to not starve in the mountains. The letter she left for her father was a masterpiece of filial diplomacy. It explained that she had discovered a spiritual calling, that she needed to find her true purpose, and that she would return when she completed her inner journey. Which, in theory, were all truths, just slightly devoid of the details about living in a cave eating wild plants. Isabella took her favorite horse, an Arabian stallion worth more than entire rural properties, and began to ride towards the Wudang Mountains, under the moonlight, feeling like the protagonist of a heroic epic which, considering she was running away from home at 23 to become a hermit, was not technically incorrect. The first few hours of the journey were surprisingly pleasant. Isabella rode on well-maintained roads, stopped at comfortable inns, ate meals prepared by competent chefs, and thought, this spiritual seeking thing is easier than I imagined. It was when she reached the mountainous region 3 weeks later that reality began to make educational suggestions about certain discrepancies between theory and practice. First, the paved roads simply ended, replaced by trails that seemed to have been designed by people who had never heard of basic engineering concepts. Isabella, who had learned to ride in perfectly flat fields, discovered that riding in mountainous terrain required slightly different skills. Second, the comfortable inns also ended, replaced by villages where the accommodations consisted of basically sleeping on the floor of huts that made the concept of rustic seem luxurious. Isabella, who had never slept on anything less soft than swan feathers, discovered that the floor has a very specific way of reminding you that it exists. Third, and most worrying, she began to realize that she did not have exactly a specific plan to find a suitable cave. Her research in the palace had been, let's say, theoretically robust, but practically slightly incomplete. It was then that Isabella had her first real experience with uncertainty, something that had never happened in 23 years of life, where all decisions were made by other people, all problems were solved by servants, and all needs were anticipated by a dedicated team. She stopped in the middle of a mountain trail, looked around at the Wudang Mountains, which were unquestionably much more mountainous than they seemed on the maps, and had her first moment of wait. What exactly am I doing? It was then that she met Zhang Wei, a local peasant who was returning from harvesting medicinal herbs, and who looked at Isabella, clearly an aristocrat lost in the mountains, with the kind of expression that suggests, "This is going to be interesting." "I am looking for a cave," Isabella said, with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that her needs would be met. "For spiritual meditation." Zhang Wei, who had seen many different types of people lost in the mountains, but never a princess looking for accommodation in caves, had the courtesy not to laugh immediately. "A cave for meditation," he repeated, as if confirming that he had understood correctly. "Have you ever lived in a cave before, my lady?" "No," Isabella admitted, "but I have read a lot about it." Zhang Wei paused, which lasted long enough to suggest that he was recalibrating his expectations about the conversation. "Do you know how to make a fire, my lady? Find water? Identify edible plants?" Isabella, who had never made a fire, never looked for water, and thought that edible plants came automatically prepared on gold plates, began to suspect that perhaps her aristocratic education had some practical gaps. "No," she said, "but I can learn." And so in the middle of the Wudang Mountains, talking to a peasant who clearly thought she had completely lost her mind, Isabella began to understand that a spiritual search through dispossession involves a surprising amount of very specific practical skills. Zhang Wei, who clearly had experience dealing with people whose ideas about life in the mountains came exclusively from books, decided that the situation required immediate educational intervention, because letting an imperial princess discover on her own how not to die in a cave would probably violate some basic conventions of peasant hospitality. "My lady," he said with the patience of someone explaining physics to a child, "do you understand that caves are cold, damp, and often inhabited by animals that do not appreciate human company?" Isabella, who had never considered the possibility that wild animals might have opinions on housing arrangements, paused contemplatively. "What kind of animals?" "Bears," Zhang Wei replied, "wolves, sometimes snakes, and depending on the season, bats, many bats." Isabella, whose closest experience with wildlife had been observing ornamental fish in artificial ponds, began to realize that her Taoist texts had been slightly vague about certain practical aspects of hermit life. "But," she said with the impeccable logic of someone who has never had to negotiate territory with bears, "if I explain that I am there for spiritual meditation, won't they understand?" Zhang Wei looked at Isabella for a long moment, as if recalibrating his estimates of how long she would survive alone. "Bears," he said carefully, "are not traditionally receptive to philosophical arguments." It was then that Zhang Wei, who had a kind heart and a practical understanding of how mountains work, made a decision that, in retrospect, saved Isabella's life. He offered to show her a cave that technically met the requirements for solitary meditation, but that, crucially, had no recent history of residents with claws. The walk to the cave took 3 hours on trails that made the palace roads look like advanced engineering concepts. Isabella, who had never walked for more than 15 consecutive minutes, discovered that her legs had very specific opinions about prolonged exercise. "How much further?" she asked after the first hour, with the breath of someone who has just discovered that breathing during exercise requires slightly different techniques. 2 hours, Zhang Wei replied, without even being out of breath, which Isabella found slightly annoying. When they finally arrived at the cave, Isabella looked at what would be her new home and had one of those realizations that are simultaneously educational and terrifying. The cave was, theoretically, suitable for human habitation if you redefined suitable as will not collapse immediately and has enough space to lie down. It was basically a hole in the rock about the size of one of the closets in her room at the palace, with no natural light, no ventilation, and a floor that was generously described as uneven. "It's perfect," Isabella said with the forced enthusiasm of someone who has just realized that maybe she should have researched more about the technical specifications of cave dwelling. Jiang Wei, who could recognize desperation disguised as optimism, decided to offer additional practical assistance. "You will need a few things, my lady. Blankets, food, a way to make fire, maybe a knife for various situations." Isabella, who had never needed various situations because she always had servants to deal with any kind of situation, agreed, recognizing that Jiang Wei clearly knew more about survival than her Taoist texts. And so, in the middle of the Wudang Mountains, with the help of a peasant who probably saved her life, Isabella began her transformation from an imperial princess to someone who was about to discover how many basic things about human existence she had never learned. The first night in the cave was educational. Isabella discovered that when you remove silk, servants, prepared food, soft beds and central heating, what remains is a very raw version of yourself having to deal with basic physical reality. She spent the whole night awake, not because of some deep spiritual epiphany, but because the cave floor had a very specific way of reminding every bone in her body that it existed. Isabella's first days as a hermit were an educational sequence of discoveries about aspects of human existence that, apparently, were not covered in traditional aristocratic education. Like, for example, the fact that real hunger is slightly different from "it's not dinner time yet." Jiang Wei had left provisions for a week, along with basic instructions on how not to die, which included fascinating details like fire needs fuel to keep burning, and spring water is safer than still water. Information that Isabella received with the attention of someone who never imagined that knowledge about fire and water would be relevant to her life. On the third day, when the provisions began to dwindle, Isabella had her first real experience with resource planning, something that had never been necessary when resources magically appeared whenever you needed them. She looked at the remaining food, calculated how many days it would last, and had a devastating mathematical revelation about the relationship between a finite amount of food and the infinite need to keep eating. It was then that she decided to try to find edible plants, an activity that, in theory, seemed simple, but that in practice revealed some important gaps in her education, like the difference between plants that nourish the body and plants that literally end your spiritual journey permanently. Isabella spent a whole morning examining leaves, roots, and wild fruits with the scientific methodology of someone who has never had to distinguish between edible and deadly poisonous. She tried several options, with results that ranged from tasteless but harmless to, "Why is my stomach making these noises?" It was after a particularly educational experience with innocent-looking mushrooms that Isabella began to understand that survival requires a very specific type of knowledge that, curiously, was not included in texts on Taoist philosophy. Solitude, which in books seemed like a poetic condition for deep contemplation, turned out to be a slightly more intense experience than she had anticipated. Isabella discovered that when you remove all distractions, conversations, entertainments, and external stimuli, what remains is a surprising amount of your own thoughts constantly happening without supervision. On the first day, she found it interesting. On the third day, she found it revealing. On the seventh day, she began to suspect that maybe her mind was slightly noisier than she imagined. On the 10th day, she was having conversations out loud with herself about subjects like, "Why are rocks so uncomfortable?" and "Do bears respect quiet hours?" But it was during the second week when hunger began to be a constant presence, when the nightly cold became an intimate companion, when solitude stopped being a romantic choice and began to be a concrete reality, that something interesting began to happen. Isabella began to realize that when you remove everything that defines you externally, all the expensive clothes, jewels, titles, comforts, and people who confirm your identity, what is left is a very raw, very basic, very honest version of who you really are when you have nothing left to hide behind. She discovered that without servants to solve problems, she was surprisingly capable of solving problems. Without prepared food, she learned to distinguish edible plants. Without soft beds, she adapted to sleeping on surfaces that, theoretically, could be considered beds, if you were flexible with definitions. More importantly, Without all the luxurious distractions, she began to realize that her mind, when not occupied with irrelevant choices, was capable of a clarity she had never experienced. It was as if all that material perfection had been a very elaborate curtain hiding something very simple, but very real. During the third week, Isabella had an epiphany that did not come through mystical visions or supernatural experiences, but through the simple and devastating realization that for the first time in 23 years, she was living, really living, making real decisions, facing real consequences, being herself, without intermediaries. She understood that all that search for spiritual dispossession was not about rejecting the material world, but about discovering who you are when the material world stops doing everything for you. It was about reconnecting with your own ability to exist, solve, create, and survive. When Jiang Wei returned a month later to check if she was still alive, he found Isabella visibly thinner, definitely dirtier, but with an expression he recognized. It was the expression of someone who had discovered that she was capable of much more than she imagined. "How was it?" he asked. Isabella looked at the cave, which was now genuinely her home, and smiled. "I discovered," she said, "that when you have everything, you have no idea who you are, and when you have nothing, you discover that you are all you need." And so, in the Wudang Mountains, an imperial princess learned that true wealth is not in having everything, but in discovering that you can live and thrive and be happy with much less than you ever imagined. And while Isabella finally discovered that you can be happy with much less than you imagine, on the other side of the sea, a Japanese samurai was about to learn that when you try to be perfect in everything, you end up being perfect in basically nothing. Because apparently in all Eastern cultures, there is always someone who looks at the natural imperfection of life and thinks, you know what this needs? Absolute control, extreme discipline, and an obsession with microscopic details. William, in the year 1185, during the Kamakura period, had just completed 15 years of martial training and had come to the devastating conclusion that he was good, very good, maybe even excellent, but he was not perfect. Which, for a samurai educated in the principles of Bushido, was basically unacceptable. William woke up every day at 4 in the morning, in his private dojo in Kamakura, with the iron discipline of someone who had turned the search for martial excellence into an exact science. He practiced kata for 2 hours, Zen meditation for 1 hour, breathing exercises for 30 minutes, and sword techniques until every movement was impeccable. The problem was that William had made the classic mistake of being too good too soon. At 30, he could cut a sheet of paper in the air, split a drop of water in half, and perform sequences of movements that other samurai spent decades trying to learn. He was, objectively, one of the most skilled warriors in all of Japan, which, paradoxically, left him absolutely miserable. Because William had discovered that the better you get, the more you notice all the small imperfections that still remain. It was as if excellence were a magnifying glass that, instead of showing how much you have progressed, showed with devastating clarity how much was still missing for absolute perfection. He began to notice things that normal samurai would never notice, like his cut being 3 degrees off the perfect angle, or his breathing being slightly irregular during complex movements, or his posture having a microscopic inclination that technically could be improved. It was then that William had an idea that any sensible person would call slightly obsessive, but that he, with the relentless logic of a perfectionist, found completely reasonable. If he wanted to achieve absolute perfection, he needed a training method that eliminated all variables, all inconsistencies, all factors that prevented mathematical precision. He decided that flowers, specifically cherry blossom petals, were the perfect object for absolute precision training. Because petals are light, unpredictable, delicate, and require exactly the kind of microscopic control that separated good technique from perfect technique. The plan was apparently simple. William would cut a cherry blossom petal exactly in half with a single movement, without touching the adjacent petals, without any fragment falling out of the designated place, and with such absolute precision that both halves were mathematically identical. When he could do this 1,000 consecutive times without error, he would know that he had achieved martial perfection. William built a special garden behind his dojo, planted exclusively with cherry trees, which bloomed in the spring with thousands of perfect petals for his scientific experiment with obsession. He calculated that, in a good season, he would have enough material for approximately 10,000 attempts, which, in retrospect, should have been a warning sign that maybe the goals were slightly unrealistic. On the first morning of the experiment, William positioned himself in front of the first blooming cherry tree, took a deep breath, focused his mind with the intensity of a laser, and executed a cut that was, technically, almost perfect. The petals split into two parts that were approximately equal, but not mathematically identical. One half was possibly 2 millimeters larger than the other. William examined the two halves, measured them with precision instruments he had specially made, and confirmed that there was a discrepancy of 1.3 millimeters between the parts. Clearly, he needed more practice. On the second attempt, he managed a discrepancy of only 0.8 millimeters. On the third, 0.9 millimeters. On the 10th, 1.1 millimeters. On the 20th, 0.7 millimeters. After 50 attempts, William stopped, looked at the meticulously documented results, and realized that he was improving, but in a statistically insignificant and completely random way. It was then that he began to suspect that maybe cherry blossom petals did not follow rigid protocols of physical consistency. But William, who had the stubborn persistence of someone who has turned perfectionism into a religion, decided that obviously the problem was not with the method, but with his still insufficient technique. He spent the rest of the spring cutting petals, documenting results, analyzing patterns, and developing increasingly elaborate theories on how to achieve perfect symmetry in objects that apparently had been designed by nature to be slightly asymmetrical. When summer arrived and the petals ran out, William had cut exactly 3,847 petals with an average precision of 0.73 millimeters of discrepancy, which mathematically represented an improvement of 0.02 millimeters from the beginning. Progress practically, but at the speed of a glacier climbing a mountain. It was during the autumn, when William was eagerly awaiting the return of spring and the petals, that he had time to reflect on the results of his scientific experiment with obsession, and he began to realize that maybe there were some uncontrolled variables in his method. First, cherry blossom. Petals, apparently, are not uniform objects. Each one has a slightly different density, variable humidity, a unique cellular structure, and, crucially, a disturbing tendency to behave according to the laws of physics rather than protocols of samurai perfection. Second, wind, which William had never considered a relevant factor, turned out to be an active participant in the experiment. Even the slightest breeze was capable of altering the petal's trajectory at the exact moment of the cut, creating discrepancies that were not his technique's fault, but that definitely ruined the symmetry. Third, and most frustrating, William began to suspect that his own breathing, heartbeat, and microscopic muscle movements were introducing infinitesimal variations that made absolute precision mathematically impossible, which led William to the logical conclusion that obviously he needed to eliminate all these variables. He built a special chamber in his garden with walls that blocked the wind, a humidification system that kept the air perfectly stable, and controlled lighting that eliminated variable shadows. It was basically a scientific laboratory dedicated exclusively to cutting petals with obsessive precision. William also developed even more refined breathing techniques, methods to slow his heartbeat, and meditation exercises that, theoretically, would eliminate involuntary muscle movement. He was essentially trying to transform himself into a human precision machine. When the next spring arrived, William was prepared for absolute perfection. He had controlled the environment, perfected his technique, and developed a rigorous scientific protocol to document each attempt. The results of the second season were slightly disappointing. His average precision improved to 0.71 millimeters of discrepancy, which represented an improvement of 0.02 millimeters in a whole year of obsessive preparation. At the current rate of progress, William calculated that he would achieve absolute perfection in approximately 243 years. It was then that he began to suspect that maybe there was a fundamental problem with his approach. But instead of questioning the goals, William decided that obviously he needed even more refined methods. He began to study advanced mathematics, physics of moving objects, and, in an impressive demonstration of academic dedication, petal aerodynamics. He developed formulas to calculate the perfect angle, ideal speed, and precise timing based on the petal's weight, air density, and the phase of the moon, because apparently the moon's gravitational force could be affecting microscopic results. William also began to make his own even more precise measuring instruments, because he suspected that commercial instruments did not have enough resolution to measure discrepancies smaller than 0.1 millimeters. It was, objectively, the most elaborate research project ever dedicated to cutting petals. During the third spring, armed with advanced scientific knowledge, custom precision instruments, and a robust mathematical theory, William was finally ready for definitive results. His first attempt of the season resulted in a discrepancy of 0.74 millimeters, which was slightly worse than his average from the previous year. William examined the data, reviewed his calculations, checked his instruments, and came to the scientific conclusion that there were clearly still unidentified variables affecting the results. It was then that he decided that, obviously, he needed even more complete isolation, even more refined technique, and even more absolute control over all possible variables. Because, in the relentless logic of perfectionism, when your method doesn't work, the solution is always more method, never less method. William spent the rest of the spring cutting petals with increasing scientific intensity, documenting every variable, measuring every result, and developing increasingly elaborate theories about why perfection remained slightly out of reach. And slowly, imperceptibly, inevitably, he began to realize that maybe he was missing something important about the nature of perfection itself. But that realization would still take a few more seasons to fully manifest. It was during the fourth spring, when William was preparing for an even more rigorous analysis of the unidentified variables, that something completely unexpected happened. A 7-year-old child, the daughter of one of the dojo's gardeners, ran into his laboratory of obsessive precision. The girl, whose name was Lily, looked at all the scientific apparatus, the custom measuring instruments, the mathematical formulas scribbled on the walls, and the piles of documentation on petal aerodynamics, and asked, with the devastating curiosity that only children can have, "What are you doing?" William, who had never tried to explain his project to someone who was not an expert in samurai perfectionism, stopped, took a deep breath and said, "I am trying to cut petals perfectly in half." Lily picked up a petal that had fallen on the floor, examined it for approximately 3 seconds and, without using any of the precision instruments that William had developed over the years, simply tore the petal with her fingers. "Like this?" she asked, holding 2 halves that were visibly completely irregular. William looked at the 2 halves, mentally measured the discrepancy, which was approximately 5 millimeters, and was about to explain why that was not even remotely close to what he considered perfection, when Lily did something that completely changed his perspective on the last 4 years of his life. She joined the 2 irregular halves, held them against the light, smiled, and said, "Beautiful, it's still a petal." And it was at that moment, surrounded by years of scientific research dedicated to achieving mathematical symmetry, that William had a realization that was simultaneously devastating and liberating. The child had just done, in 3 seconds, exactly what he had been trying to do for 4 years. She had interacted with a petal in a meaningful way. The difference was that she was not obsessed with absolute control over the result. William spent the rest of that day watching Lily play in the garden and began to notice things that 4 years of scientific analysis had never revealed. How she picked up petals that fell naturally, blew them in the wind, used them to make drawings on the ground, and at no point seemed concerned with symmetry, precision, or measurable results. She simply interacted with the petals as they were, imperfect, asymmetrical, unpredictable, and she seemed genuinely happy. It was then that William began to suspect that maybe there was a fundamental difference between perfection as control and perfection as harmony. That night, for the first time in 4 years, William did not document, measure, or analyze anything. Instead, he simply sat in the garden, watched the blooming cherry trees, and allowed the petals to fall naturally around him. And he realized something that all his scientific research on precision had completely missed. The petals, in their natural state, falling randomly, moving with the wind, landing where physics determined, were inexplicably beautiful. Not because they were symmetrical, but because they were authentic. The next morning, William took his katana, positioned himself in front of a blooming cherry tree, and for the first time in 4 years, did not think about angles, speed, timing, or measurable results. He simply breathed, felt the moment, and executed a cut that flowed naturally. The petals split into 2 parts that were visibly different. One half was approximately 2 millimeters larger than the other. William looked at the result that 4 years ago would have been considered a statistical failure, and for the first time since he began the experiment, smiled, because he finally understood that he had confused 2 completely different things: technical perfection, which was about absolute control over external variables, and true perfection, which was about harmony with the nature of things, including his own imperfect nature. William put away his measuring instruments, turned off his environmental control chambers, and filed away his mathematical formulas. Not because he had given up on seeking excellence, but because he had discovered that real excellence comes from accepting that some things are beautiful precisely because they cannot be controlled. He continued to practice, continued to cut petals, continued to seek precision, but now with a completely different understanding of what it meant to be a samurai. It was about discipline, yes, but discipline in harmony with nature, not at war with it. During the following months, William discovered that when he stopped trying to force absolute perfection, his technique, paradoxically, improved in ways he had never imagined. His movements became more fluid, his breathing more natural, his mind clearer, not because he had eliminated all the variables, but because he had learned to dance with them. A year later, when Lily returned to the garden, she found William practicing, but in a completely different way. He cut petals, observed the results, and, regardless of the symmetry, seemed genuinely satisfied. "Are you still trying to make perfect petals?" she asked. William laughed, picked up a petal he had just cut, with its 2 visibly different halves, and said, "I discovered that they were already perfect. I was the one trying to improve something that didn't need to be improved." And so, in the cherry blossom garden in Kamakura, a samurai learned that the search for perfection is valid, but only when you understand that true perfection is not in eliminating all imperfection, but in accepting that imperfection is part of the natural beauty of things, including the natural beauty of being human. And while William finally discovered that true perfection lies in accepting natural imperfection, on the other side of the mountains in Korea, a hermit was about to learn that when you decide to build a temple for one person, maybe, just maybe, you haven't fully understood the concept of humility. Because apparently, in all Eastern spiritual traditions, there is always someone who reads about modesty and simplicity and thinks, "Perfect, I will demonstrate my humility by building the largest architectural project this mountain has ever seen." James, in the year 1398 during the Joseon dynasty, had just completed 40 years of life as a merchant and had come to the conclusion that material success did not bring spiritual satisfaction, which, considering he was about to spend his entire fortune on a megalomaniacal construction, reveals a slightly ironic understanding of material renunciation. James had spent 2 decades building a commercial empire, selling silk, spices, and luxury goods throughout the Korean peninsula. He was objectively very good at accumulating wealth, which made his decision to abandon everything to seek spiritual simplicity a fascinating example of how the human mind can transform any concept into the perfect justification for doing exactly what it has always wanted to do. James's spiritual revelation came, like many spiritual revelations, during a moment of extreme financial stress. He had lost a major shipment of silk, 2 of his partners had run off with money, and his wife was, let's say, expressing very specific opinions about his skills as a provider. It was then that James, sitting alone in his office, surrounded by debt documents, had an epiphany that any cynical person would call convenient. He decided that obviously, the problem was not his questionable financial management, but the fact that he was too attached to material things. The solution, as James explained to his wife, was simple. He was going to become a hermit, live in absolute simplicity, and dedicate the rest of his life to spiritual contemplation far from all worldly distractions. His wife, who had a practical understanding of how bills work, suggested that maybe it would be better for him to solve the commercial problems first and seek spiritual enlightenment later. But James, who was already completely convinced that he had discovered his true calling, explained that material issues were exactly the kind of thing that a spiritually evolved person should not worry about, which in retrospect should have been a warning sign about certain inconsistencies in his spiritual logic. James sold everything he still had of value, paid what he could of the debts, left the rest for his wife to solve, because, as he explained, people on a spiritual quest cannot be distracted by worldly responsibilities, and set off for the Jirisan Mountains with a bag full of gold and a very specific vision of what his new life of simplicity would be like. The first thing James did, after finding a suitably isolated mountain, was to assess the terrain with the critical eye of someone who, clearly, never understood that hermit usually means a person who lives in a small cave. He found a natural plateau with a spectacular view, access to fresh water, and enough space for, well, a project that any sensible person would call too ambitious for one person. James decided that if he was going to dedicate his life to spiritual contemplation, he obviously needed a suitable space to contemplate. Not a simple cave, not a modest hut, but a temple that was worthy of the importance of the spiritual quest he was undertaking. The initial project, which James carefully designed, included a main hall for meditation, auxiliary rooms for study, contemplative gardens, a library, rooms for prolonged retreats, and, in an impressive demonstration of logistical planning, facilities to receive spiritual visitors who would certainly come to seek his wisdom. It was essentially a monastic complex designed for a population of approximately 50 monks, but intended for a hermit who wanted to live in simplicity. The irony, which completely escaped James, was that he was about to spend the next 20 years building the most elaborate monument to humility that the Korean mountains had ever seen. The construction of what James called "my simple spiritual retreat" began on a spring morning, with James carrying the first stones up the mountain and discovering that monumental architecture involves a surprising amount of real physical labor. James, who had spent 2 decades running businesses where the heaviest part of his job was carrying bags of coins, discovered that building stones have very specific opinions about gravity and that mountains were not designed with logistical convenience in mind. After a week of carrying stones, James calculated that, at the current rate, the temple's foundation would be ready in approximately 3 years, which led him to slightly reconsider the scale of the project. But James, who had turned stubbornness into a life philosophy, decided that reducing the project would be a lack of faith in the importance of his spiritual mission. Instead, he developed more efficient methods for moving heavy materials up the mountain. He built ramps, pulleys, and lever systems that were ingeniously simple and worked most of the time except when they didn't, which resulted in stones rolling down the mountain and James having to start over with a vocabulary that probably wasn't in the spiritual texts he was studying. During the first year, James managed to complete the foundations of one of the smaller halls of the complex, which represented approximately 5% of the total project. Progress that anyone with a basic knowledge of mathematics would find slightly discouraging. But James, who had the unshakable confidence of someone who never questioned whether his plans made sense, interpreted this as proof that he needed more discipline, more dedication, and, obviously, an even grander project to match his spiritual transformation. It was then that he decided to add a meditation tower that would be visible from the entire region to, as he explained to himself, inspire other spiritual seekers, which any cynical observer might interpret as making sure everyone knows how spiritually dedicated I am. During the second year, James developed a routine that was impressive in its consistency. He would wake up at sunrise, work on the construction until noon, stop to study spiritual texts, work more until sunset, and spend the nights planning expansions for the project. He also began to keep a diary documenting his spiritual progress, which consisted mainly of detailed descriptions of the construction progress, reflections on the importance of perseverance, and occasionally complaints about how heavy stones are and how high mountains are. What James did not realize during these 2 years of solitary work was that no one, absolutely no one, knew he existed. The mountain he had chosen was genuinely isolated. The nearest villages were days' walk away on trails that were not exactly marked. Merchants, travelers, and pilgrims simply did not pass by. James was literally building a monumental temple to impress an audience of 0 people. But James, who was deeply involved in what he called the work of the soul, interpreted the complete solitude as proof that he was on the right path. After all, true hermits live far from worldly distractions. The fact that he was building the most elaborate distraction the region had ever seen was an irony that completely escaped his self-awareness. During the 3rd year, James had managed to complete a main hall, 2 auxiliary rooms, and the foundations of the tower. Progress that he meticulously documented, along with deep reflections on how the construction was purifying his soul and teaching him valuable lessons about patience, determination, and material detachment. Reflections that he wrote on imported paper with expensive ink, using brushes that cost a small fortune, because, as he rationalized, quality materials were necessary to properly preserve his spiritual wisdom. It was at the end of the 3rd year, when James stopped to admire his progress, that he had his first small doubt about the project. Not about the scale, not about the purpose, but about a slightly important practical question. For whom exactly was he building this? The question bothered him for approximately 15 minutes before he found an answer that completely satisfied his need for justification. He was building it for future generations of spiritual seekers who would surely find the temple and benefit from his wisdom. It was, essentially, a gift to humanity, a completely selfless work of spiritual charity. The fact that he was simultaneously the architect, builder, and future sole user of the work was just a coincidence. Over the following years, James entered what he called his spiritual maturity phase, which suspiciously coincided with the phase in which his original project quintupled in size, because apparently the more time you spend alone on a mountain, the more grandiose ideas you have about religious architecture. In the 5th year, James decided that the temple needed elaborate Zen gardens, with stones positioned according to ancient geometric principles that he had read about in a text and interpreted with the creativity of someone who never had to explain his decisions to other people. In the 6th year, he added a library that would be the largest collection of spiritual texts in the region as soon as he could buy the books, transport them up the mountain, and build the shelves all by himself in an impressive demonstration of logistical optimism. In the 7th year, he began an aqueduct system to bring spring water to all parts of the complex, because, as he explained in his diary, a truly spiritual temple must have running water symbolizing the flow of wisdom, and not because carrying water in buckets was becoming extremely annoying. James also developed during these years an interesting relationship with imaginary visitors. He regularly talked to future disciples who would surely appear to learn from his wisdom. He prepared elaborate lectures on spiritual topics that he delivered to audiences of squirrels, birds, and occasionally rocks that had a vaguely humanoid shape. His diary. Reflections began to include complete dialogues with these imaginary visitors, who always asked very intelligent questions and were deeply impressed with his answers. Today, a young monk asked me about the nature of impermanence, James would write. I explained that just as this temple arises from the mountain, all wisdom arises from discipline. Conversations that basically happened entirely inside his head. During the 8th year, James faced his first serious logistical dilemma. His savings were running out, and approximately 60% of the project was still missing. Any sensible person at this point would have resized the project, or at least questioned whether there might be a disconnect between available means and architectural ambitions. But James, who had invested 8 years of his life and his entire spiritual identity in the project, came to a different conclusion. Obviously, the universe was testing his determination. And the answer to the test was to persevere with even more dedication. He began to save in creative ways. He ate less, slept outdoors to save construction materials for the rooms, and obsessively reused any material that could be repurposed. It was, ironically, the first time in his entire life that James actually practiced material simplicity. But instead of seeing this as a lesson on the advantages of a simple life, James interpreted it as a temporary sacrifice necessary to complete his grandiose spiritual project. During the 9th year, something interesting happened. James, for the first time since he began the construction, went down the mountain to buy supplies in a nearby village. The local merchant, who had never seen James before, asked curiously what he was doing up there on the mountain. "Building a temple," James replied, with the pride of someone finally having a chance to talk about his project, "for meditation and spiritual study." "Ah," the merchant said. "For how many monks?" James paused for slightly longer than would be natural. "1," he said finally. The merchant looked at James, who was clearly exhausted, dirty, and visibly thinner. "A temple? For 1 monk? You've been building for 9 years, alone?" "Yes," James said, and for the first time, hearing his own situation described by someone else, he realized that maybe it sounded a little unusual. "It must be," the merchant said carefully. "A very special temple." James returned to the mountain with supplies and a strange feeling that took a few days to identify. It was the first time in 9 years that someone had indirectly questioned the logic of his project. Not the dedication, not the work, not the quality of the construction, but the basic proportion between the effort invested and the final utility. That night, James looked at his temple, which now occupied a considerable area of the plateau, with its half-built tower, elaborate gardens, and functional aqueducts, and wondered for the first time if maybe, just maybe, there was something slightly disproportionate about the project. But the question bothered him for only one night. Because the next morning, James woke up, looked at all his work, and decided that obviously the problem was not with the project, but with the inability of other people to understand grandiose spiritual visions. After all, great works have always been misunderstood by contemporaries. It took another 10 years and a completely unexpected event for James to finally understand what he had really built on that mountain. During the 18th spring of the project, when James was putting the finishing touches on the meditation tower, the first real visitor in almost 2 decades appeared. A wandering monk who had gotten lost on the trails and seen the construction from afar. The monk, whose name was Hyo, climbed the mountain, looked at the impressive complex with its elaborate gardens, functional aqueducts and architecture that unquestionably rivaled imperial monasteries, and asked the question that James had been waiting for 20 years. "How many monks live here?" "Just me," James replied, with the pride of someone finally having a chance to impress a real audience. Hyo walked through the complex, admiring the quality of the construction, the attention to detail, and the ambitious scale of the project. "Did you build all this yourself?" he asked. "Yes," James said. "I have dedicated 20 years of my life to this spiritual work." Hyo stopped in front of the meditation tower, which rose majestically over the entire region. "It's impressive," he said. "May I ask why you needed all this to meditate?" The question hit James like a lightning bolt, because for the first time someone was questioning not the quality of the work, not the dedication invested, but the fundamental need to build something so grandiose for an activity that traditionally requires only inner silence. James began, and realized he didn't have an answer that didn't sound slightly megalomaniacal. Hyo sat on a rock and said gently, "May I tell you about the place where I meditate? It is a small cave in the northern mountains. It has room for 1 person to sit, nothing more. And it works perfectly." James looked at his monumental complex, which could accommodate 50 monks, had gardens that took years to plan, and a tower that could be seen for miles, and had a realization that was simultaneously devastating and liberating. He had built the most elaborate monument to his own ego that the Korean mountains had ever seen, and he had called it spiritual humility. For 20 years, he had confused grandiosity with spiritual importance, scale with meaning, and visibility with wisdom. He had turned the search for simplicity into the most complicated project possible. "I think," James said slowly, "that I may have missed the point somewhere along the way." Wonhyo smiled. "It happens more often than you think. The ego is very creative at disguising itself as spirituality." That night, for the first time in 20 years, James sat in meditation not in the elaborate main hall, not in the majestic tower, but on a simple stone in the garden under the stars. And he discovered that his mind became just as quiet sitting on a stone as it would in a monumental temple. The difference was that, sitting on a stone, he could not be impressed with his own architectural dedication. The next morning, James made a decision that anyone who knew him would find completely unexpected. He offered the temple to Wonhyo and to any monastic community that wanted to use it. "But what about you?" Wonhyo asked. "Where will you live?" James looked at a small natural cave that he had noticed on the first day, but rejected as unsuitable for his grandiose plans. "There," he said, "I think it's the right size for a person who wants to learn what true humility is." And so, in the Jirisan Mountains, after 20 years of building the most ambitious project, a hermit discovered that spiritual ego is even more subtle and dangerous than material ego. Because when you believe you are being humble while building monuments to your own importance, you can spend decades lost in your own illusion. True simplicity, James finally understood, is not about building small temples. It is about not needing to build any temple to feel spiritually important. When Wonhyo left a week later, he left James in a simple cave with only the essentials to survive, and for the first time in 2 decades, genuinely at peace. The monumental temple remained on the mountain as a permanent reminder that sometimes the grandest projects arise from the most human motivations, and that recognizing this is the first step to finding what you were really looking for. And while James finally understood that, spiritual ego builds even bigger monuments than material ego. On the other side of the world, in the Scottish Highlands, a Celtic druid was about to discover that when you decide you can control the forces of nature through increasingly elaborate rituals, nature has a very educational way of suggesting humility, because apparently, in all spiritual traditions on all continents, there is always someone who reads about harmony with nature and thinks, "Perfect, I will demonstrate my spiritual connection by dominating elements that have existed for billions of years through ceremonies I invented last week." Scotland, 1452, and we are in the Highlands, during a winter storm that was demonstrating with devastating meteorological clarity why the ancient Celts had so much respect for the forces of nature. Alistair McCrory woke up that December morning with the unshakable confidence of someone who has just discovered that obviously modern druids should have much greater control over natural elements than those primitive druids of the past. Our protagonist was a 38-year-old man who lived in a stone cabin near Loch Katrina, in a region that the locals called where even the Vikings preferred not to camp during the winter, which should have been a clue about certain climatic limitations of the area. Alistair was, technically, a druid, if you defined druid as a person who has read many ancient texts about druidism, interpreted everything, literally, and decided that he could improve millennial traditions through creative innovation. He had spent the last 15 years studying fragments of Celtic manuscripts, texts on ancestral rituals, and theories about how ancient druids supposedly controlled the weather, moved giant stones, and communicated with nature spirits. The difference between Alistair and traditional druids was that traditional druids understood that working with nature meant accepting natural rhythms, respecting forces greater than themselves, and finding harmony through humility. Alistair, who had a slightly different understanding of ancient texts, believed that working with nature meant developing techniques to direct natural forces as if they were slightly undisciplined employees. The problem began when Alistair realized that the traditional rituals he studied were, as he himself described, inefficient. ceremonies that took entire days for results that were statistically indistinguishable from coincidence. It was as if ancient druids did not have measurable goals or specific timelines. Alistair decided that, obviously, the problem was methodological. Ancient druids performed long ceremonies because they did not know how to concentrate spiritual energy efficiently. They used only natural elements because they did not have access to suitable ritual amplifiers. They respected natural timing because they had not developed techniques of spiritual acceleration. The solution, as Alistair explained to his wife Moira, was simple. He was going to modernize druidism by applying scientific principles to ancestral rituals, developing more efficient methods, and demonstrating that 15th century druids could achieve results that primitive druids only dreamed of. Moira, who had a practical understanding of how storms work, suggested that maybe it would be better to start with slightly less ambitious goals than controlling the weather. But Alistair, who was already completely convinced that he had identified the technical limitations of traditional druidism, explained that people truly connected with spiritual forces should not be afraid of practical demonstrations of power. The first experiment was apparently simple. Alistair was going to stop the rain that had been falling for 3 consecutive days through a weather command ritual that he had developed based on a creative interpretation of Celtic texts combined with some of his own technical innovations. The methodology was, as he explained, scientifically robust. He was going to build a circle of stones oriented according to specific astrological positions, burn herbs that amplified spiritual energy, and pronounce invocations that would theoretically direct natural forces according to his will. Alistair spent a whole week preparing the ritual. He studied astrological charts, collected stones of the correct size and shape, dried herbs according to methods he had extrapolated from vague descriptions in medieval manuscripts, and memorized invocations that he himself had created based on linguistic patterns that seemed suitably druidic. On the morning chosen for the ritual, Alistair positioned himself in the center of his stone circle, surrounded by carefully prepared materials, wearing clothes he had sewn specifically to maximize spiritual conductivity, and began to recite invocations with the confidence of someone who never doubted that rituals work exactly like culinary recipes. The ritual lasted 3 hours, during which Alistair burned all the herbs, recited all the invocations, and performed all the gestures he had planned with a precision that any traditional druid would find impressive if slightly misdirected. When he finished, Alistair looked at the sky, which remained exactly as before, full of dark clouds, producing constant rain, as if it had not noticed that it had just been officially commanded to stop. Alistair's first reaction was, obviously, that he had made some technical error. Maybe the stones were misaligned, maybe the herbs were not dry enough, maybe the invocations needed linguistic adjustments. What never occurred to Alistair was that maybe the fundamental premise of the experiment had certain conceptual flaws. After carefully reviewing all the technical aspects of the first ritual, Alistair came to the conclusion that, obviously, he had underestimated the complexity of the task. Controlling the weather, as he explained to Moira, required an energy amplification that a single druid working alone could not generate. The solution was, logically, to increase the scale of the ritual. More stones, more herbs, more invocations, and crucially more preparation time to ensure that each element was perfectly tuned to the relevant cosmic forces. Alistair spent the next 2 weeks building what he called an amplified power circle, which included 37 stones arranged in geometric patterns that he had calculated based on a creative interpretation of proportions found in Celtic monuments like Stonehenge, but, as he explained, improved through modern mathematical knowledge. The new ritual also included components that Alistair had developed independently, such as crystals he had collected in local caves, woods from specific trees cut during appropriate lunar phases, and, in an impressive demonstration of logistical ambition, water from 7 different springs, each representing a different aspect of natural energy. Moira, who watched her husband carry increasingly larger stones for increasingly elaborate arrangements, suggested that maybe ancient druids did not control the weather because the weather is kind of uncontrollable. Alistair, who was too busy calculating astronomical angles to consider philosophical limitations, explained that this attitude was exactly what separated visionary druids from people who simply accepted unnecessary limitations. The second ritual was substantially more impressive than the first. Alistair had developed a sequence of invocations that lasted 6 hours, included complex gestures coordinated with the sequential burning of different herbs, and required precise timing based on the positions of specific stars. During the ceremony, Alistair experienced several altered states of consciousness that he interpreted as a direct connection with elemental forces. He felt energy flowing through the stone circle, heard whispers that could be nature spirits offering guidance, and experienced sensations that were clearly different from anything he had felt during smaller rituals. When he finished, exhausted but confident, Alistair looked at the expectant sky. The rain continued exactly as before. Alistair was confused for approximately 15 minutes before reaching the obvious conclusion. The ritual had worked technically, but the natural forces were resisting change due to climatic inertia. It was like trying to stop a river. You need more power applied in a more concentrated way. The solution was, evidently, even more amplification. Over the following weeks, Alistair developed what he called an elemental domination protocol, which included the construction of multiple stone circles connected by energy lines that he marked on the ground using smaller stones, crystals, and patterns he had developed based on sacred geometry that he himself had extrapolated from Celtic symbols. The third ritual would be the most ambitious ever attempted by any druid in the history of Scotland, at least according to the records Alistair could find. It would last a full day, include the sequential burning of dozens of different types of herbs, and involve invocations directed at each individual elemental force responsible for specific aspects of the weather. Alistair had also decided that part of the problem was that he was being too polite with the natural forces. Traditional rituals were basically requests, when what was needed were clear and direct commands. On the morning of the third ritual, Alistair was technically prepared for the most powerful demonstration of druidic control that the Scottish Highlands had ever witnessed. What happened next was educational in several ways that Alistair had not anticipated. Alistair's third ritual began at sunrise on a morning that was, ironically, almost rainless, which he interpreted as a sign that the natural forces were already responding to his amplified spiritual presence, when it was probably just normal meteorology following patterns that had existed for millions of years, regardless of druidic rituals. Alistair had spent the previous night fasting and meditating, preparing his mind for what he called direct interface with planetary consciousness. He had studied texts about druids who supposedly moved mountains, altered the courses of rivers, and commanded winds, and was convinced that with proper preparation, he could demonstrate at least basic control over local precipitation. The ritual began with Alistair positioning himself in the center of the main circle, surrounded by 6 smaller circles, each dedicated to a specific element: earth, water, fire, air, spirit, and, in his own innovation, willpower, which he had decided was clearly a fundamental element that ancient druids had neglected. The first phase lasted 3 hours, during which Alistair sequentially burned herbs, recited increasingly authoritarian invocations, and performed gestures he had developed to direct spiritual energy with maximum efficiency. It was like conducting an orchestra, only instead of musicians, he was trying to direct forces that created the universe. During the second phase, Alistair began to notice changes in the environment around him. The wind, which had been calm, began to intensify. The clouds, which had been scattered, began to concentrate, and the temperature, which had been mild, began to drop noticeably. Alistair interpreted this as initial success. The natural forces were clearly responding to his commands. It was just a matter of directing the energy properly to achieve the specific results he wanted. What Alistair did not consider was that, perhaps, sudden climatic changes are not always signs of successful control. Sometimes they are signs that you have awakened natural systems that preferred to be sleeping. During the third phase, when Alistair was reciting the most powerful invocations specifically directed at forces that control precipitation, the wind intensified dramatically. The clouds, which had concentrated, became visibly darker, and they began to make noises that were not exactly in the Druidism manual that Alistair had studied. It was then that it began to rain, not the gentle, steady rain that had been falling in the previous days, but torrential rain accompanied by wind that made the stones of the circle tremble and sounds that seemed vaguely as if the sky were expressing very specific opinions about climate control rituals. Alistair, who was in the middle of the most important invocations, decided that obviously this was part of the process. The natural forces were reorganizing according to his commands. It was just a matter of maintaining concentration and completing the ritual to direct all this energy in the desired direction. What happened next was meteorologically impressive. The storm intensified until it became what modern meteorologists would call a significant weather event. Winds that tore branches from trees, rain that turned the ground into essentially mud, and thunder that seemed to be responding directly to Alistair's invocations. Every time he recited an invocation, a thunderclap responded, which Alistair initially interpreted as confirmation that he was in direct communication with elemental forces. It was when a lightning bolt struck one of the trees about 20 meters from the circle that Alistair began to suspect that maybe the natural forces were responding to his rituals, but not necessarily in the way he had planned. The tree, which was a centuries-old oak, split in half with a noise that made all his stone circles seem slightly inadequate to handle the energies he had apparently awakened. Alistair, who was soaked, shivering with cold, and beginning to question certain fundamental premises of his experiment, decided that maybe it was time to end the ritual in a controlled manner and, well, see if he could convince the natural forces to return to their previous state. The problem was that Alistair had spent months developing rituals to amplify and direct natural energy, but he had never considered it necessary to develop rituals to turn off natural energy that was not cooperating properly. It was like accelerating a car without knowing where the brake was. While the storm continued to intensify, and Alistair was realizing that he might not have as direct control over natural forces as he had theorized, he tried various approaches to diplomatically end what had become a very public demonstration of why ancient druids were slightly more cautious with large-scale rituals. First, he tried simply asking the natural forces to return to their previous state, using polite invocations. That included thanks for the productive spiritual dialogue and respectful suggestions that maybe it was time to conclude the session. The storm apparently was not interested in politeness. Then, Alistair tried more direct commands, using the same authoritarian invocations that had supposedly initiated the whole process, but directed to reverse the effects. It was like trying to undo a recipe by shouting the ingredients in reverse order. The wind, if one wanted to be anthropomorphic, seemed to be laughing. It was when another lightning bolt struck, this time much closer, cracking one of the stones of the main circle, that Alistair had a realization that was simultaneously humiliating and educational. He had no control whatsoever over what was happening. He never had. And the idea that human rituals could command forces that have existed for billions of years was perhaps slightly megalomaniacal. Alistair abandoned the stone circles, ran to his cabin, with the dignity of someone who has just discovered that meteorology is a science that does not accept amateurs, and spent the rest of the storm indoors, listening to winds that seemed to be demonstrating exactly who was responsible for the weather in the Scottish Highlands. The storm lasted for 2 whole days, during which Alistair had enough time to reconsider several fundamental premises about druidism, natural control, and his own understanding of how ancestral forces work. When it finally stopped, Alistair went out to assess the results of what he now called my educational experiment with forced humility. The stone circles were partially destroyed, several trees had fallen, the ground was completely reorganized by the rain, and there was clear evidence that nature had used the last 2 days to redecorate the landscape according to its own aesthetic criteria. It was then that Moira, who had spent the storm praying to Christian saints and questioning her marital choices, found Alistair sitting in what was left of the main circle, looking at the destruction with the expression of someone who has just understood something fundamental about proportions. "How was the climate control?" she asked, with the tone of someone who already knew the answer. Alistair looked at the wreckage of his months of ritual preparation, at the centuries-old tree split in half, at the ground that seemed to have been reorganized by geological forces, and said, "I discovered that when you try to control nature, it has a very educational way of teaching you who is really in charge." It was at that moment that Hamish MacLeod, an elder from the nearby village who had come to check if they had survived the storm, arrived and saw the situation. Hamish, who was over 70 years old and had witnessed many storms, but never one that seemed to have been personally offended by something. "Alistair," he said, looking at the ritual wreckage, "what exactly were you doing before the storm?" Alistair, who no longer had the energy to justify advanced druidic methodologies, said simply, "Trying to improve nature." Hamish paused for long enough to suggest that he was recalibrating his expectations about the conversation. "Improve nature," he repeated. "Yes," Alistair said. "I thought I could make it work more efficiently." Hamish looked at the destruction around, at the destroyed centuries-old tree, at the scattered stone circles, and had the expression of someone who has just understood why the storm had seemed particularly angry. "Alistair," he said gently, "nature has been working perfectly well for a few million years without consulting." And it was at that moment, surrounded by the wreckage of his control rituals, that Alistair finally understood the fundamental difference between working with nature and trying to be the boss of nature. Traditional druids, he realized, did not control natural forces. They learned to cooperate with them, to understand their rhythms, to respect their wisdom, and to find harmony through humility, not domination. In the following months, Alistair developed a completely different approach to druidic spirituality. Instead of building stone circles to amplify his power, he began to simply sit in nature and observe how things worked when no one was trying to improve them. He discovered that trees did not need rituals to grow. They simply grew, following patterns that were inexplicably perfect. He discovered that rivers did not need commands to flow. They naturally found the most efficient path through any terrain. He discovered that seasons changed, weather evolved, and life flourished through processes that were simultaneously simple and incomprehensibly complex, and that worked perfectly without human supervision. The only thing Alistair kept from his previous experiments was a small circle of stones, not to amplify power, but to mark a place where he sat regularly to do nothing but be present with whatever was happening in nature around him. Moira, who observed this transformation, noticed that, paradoxically, Alistair seemed more connected with natural forces when he stopped trying to control them. He could predict weather changes, understand seasonal patterns, and even occasionally communicate with wild animals, not through elaborate rituals, but through patience, observation, and respect. "How are you doing that?" she asked, after seeing him spend an entire afternoon being visited by deer that normally avoided human presence. "I stopped trying to impress nature with elaborate rituals," Alistair replied, "and started letting nature teach me how it works." A year later, when Hamish MacLeod visited again, he found Alistair sitting quietly in his small circle, observing clouds with the patience of someone who had learned that some of the best conversations happen without words. "Still trying to control the weather?" Hamish asked. Alistair smiled. "I discovered that when you stop trying to control, you finally get to participate." And so, in the Scottish Highlands, a druid learned that true power does not come from dominating forces greater than yourself, but from finding your place in the natural harmony that already exists and has always existed. Nature, Alistair finally understood, does not need to be improved or controlled or directed. It needs to be respected, observed, and honored. And when you do that, it shares wisdom that no ritual, however elaborate, can force. The storms continued to happen when they needed to happen. The seasons continued to change according to their own schedules. And Alistair finally found peace in being a grateful participant instead of a frustrated director of the eternal dance between all the elements. And so, Through 5 stories separated by centuries, we discovered that the human search for evolution has an almost comforting comical consistency. Arthur discovered that you can't hack wisdom, no matter how well you organize the schedule. Some things simply cannot be rushed. Enlightenment works like sleep. The more you force it, the more distant it becomes. Isabella learned that when you have everything, you need to lose everything to discover who you really are. True wealth is not in accumulating, but in discovering that you can thrive with much less than you imagined. William understood that true perfection is not in controlling every variable, but in accepting that some things are beautiful precisely because they cannot be controlled. Harmony surpasses precision, always. James realized that spiritual ego builds even bigger monuments than material ego. Real humility does not need grandiose temples to feel important, and Alistair discovered that true power does not come from dominating forces greater than yourself, but from finding your place in the natural harmony that already exists. Nature does not need to be improved. It needs to be respected, observed, and honored. 5 lessons, 5 cultures, 1 universal truth. All of us, in all eras, make the same hilarious mistakes in the same eternal search. We create elaborate problems to solve simple problems, and we discover that what we were looking for was available from the beginning. If you have made it this far, congratulations. You have officially survived 2 hours of millennial wisdom seasoned with devastating irony, which honestly is more spiritual endurance than most people can muster, especially considering you probably had important things to do like sleep. If these ancestral stories have touched something in you, leave a like, share with someone who is also building unnecessary temples, and subscribe because apparently we have more millennial traditions to dissect. And now, a quick question. Next episode, Greek mystics or medieval alchemists? Let us know in the comments.